So acid rain. As a historical background, it was first discussed in 1852, 160 some years ago, by a Scottish chemist, Robert Smith. And he published a book about 20 years later called Acid or Air and Rain, the Beginning of Chemical Climatology. So acid rain impacts marble structures, it destroys limestone buildings, it can cause haze in the mountains, it impacts survival of trees and aquatic life in lakes and streams. This is actually a picture from a mountaintop very close to here, and this is just a picture of the Blue Ridge Parkway, which has been impacted by acid rain. So to give you an idea of where this occurs, it's mainly in the northeast part of the United States, and it comes from coal-burning power plants that are in our region of the country. That sulfur dioxide is emitted high into the atmosphere, migrates north, and then results in acid deposition in lakes and streams in New York and in Pennsylvania and other parts of the Northeast. Society became aware of that in the 1970s from a series of New York Times articles that began to demand action. And the U.S. Congress passed the Acid Deposition Act in 1980, and that just called for 18 years of research and study. And this was the National Acidic Precipitation Assessment Program. And many people then began to advocate for their particular policy with this national agency. And for example, industrial representatives warned of dire economic impact if we force power plants to reduce emission of sulfur oxides, or if we require car manufacturers to include catalytic converters that reduce nitrogen oxides in the atmosphere. But what actually happened was many new companies were created to design methods to remove sulfur oxides from coal-burning power plant exhaust, to construct and install that equipment, and then to design and construct equipment that is incorporated into automobiles to reduce nitrogen oxide emissions. By 1991, the study found that 5% of New England lakes were acidic, with acid rain from sulfates, sulfuric acid rain being the most common problem. 2% of those lakes could not support brook trout any longer. And in 6% of those lakes, minnows didn't survive. And I'll show you some data that relates to acid precipitation in a little bit. In 1989, the U.S. Congress passed a series of amendments to the Clean Air Act that was passed about 30 years earlier. And those amendments called for a cap-and-trade system designed to control emissions of sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides, and they called for a reduction of about 10 million tons of SO2 emitted to the atmosphere. What actually happened was in the U.S., there was a reduction by about 20 million tons of sulfur oxides, about 10 million tons of nitrogen oxides. I'll show you that data here in a minute. And Europe actually did much better than that. So this is the amount of the sulfur dioxide in blue and nitrogen oxide in red emitted. This is the 1970s. This is by 2008, and we see a reduction of about 20 million tons in sulfur oxides and about 10 million tons in nitrogen oxides. And as a consequence of that, the acid deposition from rainfall, which in 1994 was quite high in the northeast part of the U.S., was now much better. So red means low pH, lots of acid rain, and lighter colors, more towards green, mean less acid deposition. So the main point from this is implementing environmental regulations does have an impact, had an impact particularly on acid rain. So the way this was done was there were scrubbers added to the exhaust stream of coal-burning power plants. The local power plant in Asheville, for example, about 8 years ago, put in scrubbers to the coal-burning power plants. And those scrubbers essentially inject lime, calcium oxide, which reacts with the sulfur dioxide to form calcium sulfite, which then is incorporated into gypsum, which makes wallboard. So it actually was a benefit when they were able to do that. Catalytic converters were added to cars, and those catalytic converters reduce the emission of nitrogen oxides to the atmosphere. We're next going to turn our attention to ozone destruction. Chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, were first synthesized in the 1920s as a replacement for refrigerants ammonia, and sulfur dioxide that are toxic. You may not know this, but your grandmother or great-grandmother had a refrigerator. It would be at the back porch or the back door of the kitchen, so they could push it out the door if it developed a leak, because these refrigerants are toxic. By 1986, there was about $135 billion worth of installed equipment in the U.S. that were dependent upon CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. In the 1970s, CFCs were used as cleaning agents for electrical components. They were used as refrigeration fluids for air conditioners and refrigerators. They were used to blow foam agents that helped insulate those refrigerators. And Sherry Rowland, who won a Nobel Prize about 15 years ago, first caused for the phase out of CFCs in the late 1970s. So what was the response from industry? Pinnacle Chemical Company was the third largest producer of CFCs in the U.S., and the CEO talked of economic chaos if CFCs were phased out. DuPont, which produced about a fourth of all worldwide CFCs, the chairman of DuPont said that ozone depletion theory is science fiction tale, a load of rubbish, utter nonsense. I guess we could substitute for ozone depletion climate change if you wanted, because we hear the same thing today about the science being fiction, a load of rubbish, etc. DuPont warned that the cost in the U.S. alone would exceed $135 billion and that entire industries would fold. The U.S. was not alone. Europe had a similar warning. They said that the impact will cause many small firms to go out of business. It'll cause inflation, unemployment, both nationally and internationally. So in the late 1970s, several states, mainly Oregon and Washington, banned the use of CFCs in spray propellants for underarm deodorant, actually. In 1985, an ozone hole was discovered over the South Pole. The next slide will show that. And this caused a widespread call from the public and from some politicians to phase out or eliminate the use of CFCs. So why did this ozone hole develop? Well, it's because the mechanism that Rowland first proposed didn't operate in the South Pole. So the research that I do in terms of atmospheric chemistry focuses on getting the mechanism correct. So that's just a little plug for my research area. The Montreal Protocol in 1989 and many amendments since caused for the phase out of CFCs in developed countries by 2000, and then in developing countries later on, depending on which developing country you were in. Well, industries knew that they had to phase it out by 2000, so they began to do it much earlier. And what was the impact of the Montreal Protocol? Well, this shows the ozone hole over Antarctica. What you want to look at is purple's bad, and no purple or not much blue is good. And so this is 1979, 80, 80, 82, 83, 84. And what you can see is purple begins to develop about 1987, and there's more purple, meaning there's a hole in the ozone layer over the South Pole. And I'll show you this data again in a minute. So this is what actually happened. The call for the phase out due to the Montreal Protocol was in 89. And by about 1994, 95, it reached a maximum and began to decline. So it's clear again that instituting requirements to remove these from the atmosphere or not release into the atmosphere was successful. So the lessons we should learn from this was the first response from industry is denial, and the second response is to claim great financial harm if the proposed rules are implemented. The second thing you should learn is that pressure from the public has often been required to get Congress to act, and the public requires a smoking gun. The smoking gun was the ozone hole over Antarctica for the ozone destruction, and the smoking gun was acid deposition in rivers and streams in the Northeast for acid rain. The reality is that new industries are generated, creating new jobs, and these new industries keep the economic engine moving. Now we'll talk about global climate change. So very briefly, sunlight emits ultraviolet radiation that passes through our atmosphere, hits the Earth's surface. The Earth's surface absorbs that and reemits it as infrared radiation. There are gases that we're going to call greenhouse gases that encompass the globe. Some of these gases absorb infrared. that infrared is either emitted to the outer regions of the atmosphere or it's re-emitted back to Earth, and as re-emitted back to Earth, it warms the planet and changes the climate. These are some greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is the most common. There's water, there's methane, nitrogen oxides, chlorofluorocarbons, and the replacements for chlorofluorocarbons are hydrochlorofluorocarbons, HCFCs. So these are the replacements for CFCs. So the things that are replacing CFCs that are banned are also greenhouse gases. A little bit of history. So Fourier of Fourier transform fame was the first person to talk about global temperatures and the importance of understanding that in terms of humankind. Tyndall showed that nitrogen and oxygen, the primary component of the atmosphere, don't absorb infrared, but carbon dioxide does. So carbon dioxide is the greenhouse gas. My great-great chemical grandfather is Arrhenius. He's a fairly famous chemist who won a Nobel Prize in 1903. And 120 years ago he wrote a paper on the influence of carbonic acid in the air upon the temperature of the ground. He had done 2 years of calculation with the moon as his model to come up with a prediction that if you double the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you would warm the planet by 5 degrees. The best atmospheric models today make a similar prediction. This was 120 years ago. And because I was tracing my genealogy and he was my great chemical grandfather in the 1970s, I read this paper. It was one of the few papers he'd written in English about the influence of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere on the temperature of the Earth. So I want to turn now and talk about threshold events in science. So we know from physics that you have to have a critical mass of nuclear material before a nuclear explosion would occur. We know from chemistry that the reactants must have energy above the activation barrier before a reaction will happen. We know in biology that you have to have a certain concentration of toxic substance before it becomes lethal. We know from meteorology that hurricanes don't form until the sea surface temperature exceeds 28 degrees. So as I looked at that, I got to thinking, well, it must mean there's also thresholds in environmental science. And so I wrote a paper about 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago actually, called Thresholds of Global Catastrophe, Ecological Thresholds. Now, that was a stupid name. I should have called it tipping points, which someone about 5 or 6 years later came up with that term. I should have called it a tipping point. But I called it an ecological threshold. There's actually the paper that I wrote. And I'm going to consider 2 pieces of evidence, one from ozone destruction and one from acid rain. So this is data from the 1960s to about 1980. This is the ozone concentration over the South Pole, and it bounces around some, but it looks to be fairly linear. And if you would have made predictions based on that 20 years of data, you would have been wrong. Because yes, it bounced around for about 20 years until there was a threshold amount of CFCs in the atmosphere, and then the ozone diminished dramatically. And this is the onset of what we call the ozone hole over the South Pole. So there's a first example of reaching a threshold. Second example is from acid rain. This is survival of fish, pH 7, you lower it to 6, if 1 or 2 out of 100 die, you lower it to 5, a few more die. Just below 5, they essentially all die. You've reached a threshold. Any acid content great enough to lower the pH below 5 will kill most of your fish. So that means that we should anticipate environmental thresholds with respect to global climate change. So let's do a summary. The first response from industry and some politicians has been denial and claims the science is wrong, just like it was for acid rain, just like it was for ozone destruction. The second response is to claim great financial harm if proposed rules are implemented, just like it was for acid rain and ozone destruction. But there won't be a smoking gun that will sway the public opinion, I don't believe, at least for global climate change, not like there was for acid rain or like there was for ozone destruction. So we need new policies, and if we implement those, we'll get new industries that will provide renewable energy sources and or implement energy conservation. This is going to be an economic engine that's going to drive the development of this country if we would just take the step. So we have to hope for policies, new laws before the environmental threshold is reached that will make reversal of climate change impossible, because once you reach the threshold, it happens and you can't reverse it. So thanks for your attention, and in summary, I'm deeply concerned about global climate change. Thank you.